and welcome to the DEBAKEY CV live studios. Thank you very much for joining us for this special edition promoted by the ISEVS, the International Society of Endovascular Specialists. I'm the president of that society, and my co-moderator today is Dr. Palma Shaw, and Palma is joining us from Upstate New York. Palma, can you introduce our guests?
Thanks, Alan. It's really a pleasure to talk. Today we have two incredibly brilliant CEOs. I cannot wait to hear what they want to talk about. We have Erica Rogers from Silk Road Medical and Debbie Sukin, who's the Regional Senior Vice President of Houston Methodist and the Chief Executive Officer for the Houston Methodist, the Woodlands Hospital. Before we begin, I'd like to say that the last year has been a challenge in so many ways. The already strained healthcare system needs to find a way to cut costs while improving quality and eliminate disparities to allow for an equitable access to healthcare. We thought a meeting of the minds, so to speak, between healthcare and industry leaders could stimulate an important discussion that would enlighten our viewers. First, I'd like to introduce a little more about Erica Rogers. Erica Rogers is the president and CEO of Silk Road Medical. She has spent over 25 years in the medical device industry and has helped develop products ranging from peripheral catheters to intraocular lenses to advanced contraceptive devices. She has founded two companies as employee number one and worked inside large companies such as Boston Scientific. She has a bachelor's degree in zoology and holds over 15 patents. She is passionate about complex medical problems and curious about the intersection of innovation and value-based care. In 2020, Erica received the prestigious ENY Entrepreneur of the Year Award, and she has been named by Silicon Valley Business Top Journal Top 100 Women of Influence and named as one of the Upstart 50 of elite leaders. Alan, would you like to introduce our other guest?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. And welcome, Erica. So it's my privilege to introduce who I've known as Debbie Sukin, but it's Dr. Debbie Sukin. Congratulations in getting your PhD. When I first met Debbie was when I moved down here from Atlanta. And at that time, I was the chief of vascular surgery at Baylor College of Medicine. Baylor was situated at Methodist Hospital. I worked for her dad. Debbie's dad was the president of Baylor College of Medicine, a preeminent pediatrician. A lot of water under the bridge since we first met, but she was my boss, inside the Heart and Vascular Center because she was the vice president for the Heart and Vascular Center. And she's come a long way. Now Debbie is a senior vice president, regional vice president over 4 hospitals. We have an A hospital system. We kind of split it down the middle, and Debbie is in charge basically of 4 of those hospitals. But she's also worked in our competition in town and has built multiple hospitals really along the way. I don't want to say this too loudly because it gets me a bad reputation with our physicians here. Our administration in the Methodist system is the best that I have ever worked with. And it's a remarkably flat organization. And so it's easy to get access to people like Debbie, Mark Boom, Roberta Schwartz on a daily basis. And I think that's one of the keys to success here. So Debbie has many, many accolades. I'm not going to go through them because I really want to get into this conversation and hear what we can learn from your success stories. These are 2 incredible women. I have the opportunity to be on panels basically along with Erica, and that's one of the reasons that you're selected here, because I know you can deliver this message of what we need to know for people to follow in your footsteps and be successful. So Palma, can I kick it back to you and ask the first question?
Sure. I think that from a physician's perspective, we'd like to hear how leadership in industry and healthcare could actually, are you in sync, or do you feel like there's areas where there's disparity that you could come together to have things run more efficiently for healthcare?
Well, Debbie, I'll go ahead and kick that one off. I think, Dr. Shaw, it's a really interesting question. Is industry and healthcare in sync? And I would say in many respects, yes, because at the top of the pyramid, at the top of the sort of value chain for all of us is the patient, or it should be the patient if it isn't, right? And so to the extent that we're all thinking about outcomes, we're all thinking about what's best for patients on the whole, I would say that we are in sync. I think industry, frankly, if I'm honest and I look myself in the mirror, I'd say that we could do a better job at elevating the conversation to people like Debbie. I know we spend a lot of time in industry thinking about physicians and thinking about their needs and thinking about the needs even in the kind of OR setting or in the cath lab setting. But I don't think we elevate the conversation as much as we possibly could. Debbie, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, what I would say is that industry and really the drive for innovation is what is changing how hospitals today and how our patients are cared for. And there's multiple examples in a very short period of time. But, you know, if you just think about how patients, whether you're talking about neuro, cardiac, or even general surgery, from when I first entered the healthcare system where we, you know, used to do a cholecystectomy and they used to stay X number of days, and just think of how the technology and how we actually deliver the care and the interventions. And so there's no doubt that innovations have an impact on really producing a better outcome for the patient. And there's lots of, again, examples, whether it's less blood loss, whether it's a shorter length of stay. But in running hospitals and in the healthcare system, when we talk about dollars, we have to connect those dots. And so I think that it's a tough sell initially when someone, and I'll just use an example, comes in industry and they want to sell a new piece of equipment, or they want to sell a new device, a disposable device, for an example. The reality is that our healthcare system today, so Medicare will pay based on one rate. They don't care what you spend. And so it's our job to collectively come together to drive that innovation, to produce a better outcome, and really to drive that efficiency. And I call that the art of medicine. But it's the art of medicine in running it from a hospital administrator standpoint. So no doubt that there's those partnerships. I think how we drive not only the patient experience and the clinical outcome, but also from just a sheer administrative, I think those two probably could come together sooner rather than later in that journey. I think we get there, but I think we could collaborate at an earlier point in time as a part of that journey.
Yep, that's exactly what I'm hearing, and I think I share that view with you, is that the moment in time when you're asked to make the buying decision is not the moment in time to be learning about technological advances that in theory are helpful for patients and in theory helpful to your bottom line. You know, maybe improve outcomes or reduce costs overall in the system. And so I would say industry on the whole could do a better job on the front end. And I know, Dr. Lumsden, you have this great story about Siemens and how you interacted with them earlier to make some important buying decisions that played out over a decade, really.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to that example was, we are, Siemens are a big partner at Methodist Hospital, and that's been an evolution. It started off with a few physicians who were interacting and doing development work. Then there was an opportunity around education to kind of scale that up. And then it was an opportunity to take this to a whole another level. And I think the pivot point there was the physicians had already been going out to meet the Siemens leadership. But what we did was we took everybody who was going to be involved in it, from the VP for the supply chain, the VP for the Heart and Vascular Center, the CEO for the hospital. And we really spent a day and a half really brainstorming around the science, which could be moved here, the projects. What I will say, I think that was a pivotal point, because it was the first time really that our administration had kind of seen the level of expertise that we see inside these companies. What they see typically are salespeople, you know, who want to come along and basically leverage the relationship with the physician because we want to buy X. And there's so much more to this relationship that can evolve. And that really changed the dynamic of the interaction that happened with Siemens because of that interaction.
So I would just, really expand upon that. So the way that I call that is you move it from a transactional relationship to a partnership. And if you really believe that there are aligned values and there's an aligned vision between both industry and the hospital and what we are essentially aligned to do together, then I think great things can happen. And I'll just share with you, more than 20 years ago, I was working for a hospital where we literally sat around the table and said, we have X number, 25 different sales folks from this one company coming and selling at any point of entry into the health system. And we sat down with the executives at that company and we said, okay, understand our health challenge, which is we need to figure out how to essentially use less or use something more appropriately, because our pie of dollars is getting smaller. And so how about we change this around, and if you help us better utilize what you're wanting us to sell versus your sales folks being incentivized off of every widget they sell, but we actually figure out how to grow the market overall together, but do it in a more efficient way and actually have savings along the way, then that's really beginning, and that's helping us. And then, of course, when we do better, and I think this is always the key that I share with physicians, when we do well, we're able to reinvest and we're able to continue to grow and develop, whether that means recruit, whether that means put it back into actual supplies, or buying new equipment, or building new buildings. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, I just have one final comment on this one, Dr. Shaw, which is I think there was a big sea change 25 years ago. I was part of that, where big corporations who sell across the hospital, they're in the ICU, they're in the OR, they're in the cath lab, they're in all of these different areas, did a better job at figuring out how can we bundle all of these things together and create real value for the hospital. And so I think large corporations really figured that out, and I feel like that's gotten better. The one sort of cautionary tale is that there's also the need to create space for innovation. And innovation, real leapfrog innovation, often doesn't happen in those very large corporations who themselves are very much focused on the bottom line. And so the dollars spent on kind of leapfrog R&D are often less. Because it requires that company to take too much risk in terms of capital allocation. And so where you see a lot of the breakthrough technology coming from are smaller companies, right, that maybe have one widget or one sort of value proposition that they're selling. And so it's creating room for both of these things in the ecosystem, and I think it's a lesson for companies like ours to get, we're really good, and we'll get to this, I know, Dr. Shaw, at other constituents and engaging them earlier. But I think we could certainly do a better job at the hospital administration side, engaging early on what it is we're trying to invent and what we think the real problem to solve is, and getting the input from people like you.
This is incredible, and this nicely dovetails into my next question. So everything you're just covering now was essentially a mini version of my MBA, right? So very helpful. But what about aligning internal and external forces strategically? Because everybody you're dealing with doesn't have an MBA. They may not have this vision. They're not necessarily enlightened. They're focused on their day-to-day, get to work, get in, get out, go home. How do you strategically align these interests from the internal and external people to bring together industry and the hospital systems? How would you approach that?
You want to go first, Debbie?
I would say, this is where I really encourage those who want to who are innovative and they want to make a difference. And I think you have to appreciate that that isn't necessarily what everyone's forte is. And so you have to appreciate kind of where everyone is. But what I would always say is, you have to identify those like-minded individuals. And I think it is happening where we actually are putting together both industry outside external forces, and then also I would say partnering with those who are passionate internally. Hospitals can no longer just deliver care. They have to also be on the forefront of innovation. And so here at Houston Methodist, we have a Center for Innovation. We started that Center for Innovation with what we would consider like-minded individuals, both around the table in administration, but more importantly, with physicians. And I think it is about the recognition that you can't create on your own, nor should you, because there's the expertise outside. It's about reaching across the aisle and saying, we want to influence, we want to play in this. And we don't know that we know necessarily how to approach it all, but let's get those like-minded folks around the table so we can begin to generate off of those ideas. And I think what Erin said is exactly right. Limiting folks that can think like that and want to think like that is the last thing you want. You got to get them into a room, you've got to get them outside of their norm, and you have to let them fly, because everybody plays a role in really driving something that doesn't exist today. And quite frankly, I think that that's what makes doing what we do It's what makes it fun. It's what makes it rewarding. And I think, again, I'm so lucky to work for a system where that really is the foundation of what Dr. DEBAKEY did all those years ago. I think about his partnership with NASA. I think about his partnership in figuring out with industry to create the Dacron graph. I mean, all of those things. And I think it's just we've taken it to a different level. So.
But before you jump in, Erica, let me remind the audience that they can send questions in, and they can either do it by going on the web to polev.com, enter the word DEBAKEY, and then just go, you can go ahead and basically follow the prompts, or by text. You text the word DEBAKEY to 37607. Text DEBAKEY to 37607, and we'll be happy to kind of triage your questions. So sorry to interrupt, Erica.
Oh no, that's great. So look, I share Debbie's enthusiasm for bringing like-minded people together. You know, I think that the challenge is there aren't always like-minded people, right? So look, I think the art of negotiating kind of comes down to two basic real fundamentals, which is one, spend more time listening than talking. And I think it's important to really understand the points of view. And at the top of the hour before the show started, Debbie, you and I were talking about your thesis and how, you know, you sought to understand how physicians think about the healthcare environment, right? So I think it's understanding what is the motivation of the various constituents around the table. And I would say, you know, at our company at Silk Road, it's one of the things that we hold with the highest value is really listening to all of the constituents, understand what's important to them. And you know, when you're advancing a new technology, some physicians care about, you know, is this going to be faster? Am I going to get home to my family sooner? Am I going to get to the other aspects of my clinical practice sooner? Some physicians care about reimbursement. Some physicians care, you know, put outcomes at the top of the food chain. And of course, they all do. But in terms of prioritizing how they think about technologies, hospital administrators have very different points of view as well, and they're not all the same. If only they were all like you, Debbie, that'd be amazing. So it's really spending more time listening than talking and figuring out what is the unmet need for each of these constituents around the table and finding out, is there something for everyone? And then I think the second piece, Dr. Shaw, of negotiation is the recognition that you're not going to make everyone happy. Right, there's always going to be some constituent around the table that finds whatever it is that we're doing distasteful, or they don't agree with us, or whatever. And sometimes it's an advancement in one specialty can sometimes mean, you know, 2 steps back for another specialty, particularly as you're shifting from, you know, open surgical procedures to minimally invasive. You know, you create sometimes winners and losers. What we try to do in industry is create more winners than losers. And so if you're looking at a new set of technologies, you're looking at advancing medicine, can you create more winners than losers?
Mm-hmm. So let me jump in, Palma, and I want to ask a question about culture, actually. And so, oft used word, we know it's important, kind of difficult to define. But you build a company, it's a product, but it's a bunch of people that you got to bring together and got to make them work together. A hospital is probably the biggest example. I remember when I left Emory, which is a very nice culture, and I moved down to Houston. You were there. This was a pretty rough and tumble place. It was shocking to me, to be honest with you. And yet we've reversed that.
Absolutely.
Over, you know, a relatively short period of time. So how does a CEO change the culture in the organization?
Okay, well, let me just set it straight for everyone who's listening in. A relatively short period of time is a decade plus. So let me just set that straight. It's not, nothing big is done. I always say this, nothing big is done in a day. You have to have big visions, and there's nothing more important than culture. You have to have the philosophy, start from the top. And it has to be pervasive. Literally, you have to ensure that everyone understands that values in an organization, the values set the foundation. The values of the organization is not something you just talk about on day one in orientation. I cannot stress that enough. It's something I always say, we live, we act upon, we talk about every single day. And values of the organization and really setting the culture it's the how we behave, it's the how we act, it's the how we actually deliver the care. So if you ask me, how do you start a hospital from scratch in a really crowded market with 4 other hospitals in a 10-mile radius, who, by the way, all provide heart care, the number one differentiator is going to have to be on how you put a program together, no doubt, on what will differentiate it on that clinical care. But the other piece is the how we deliver the care. And that's the culture. So I always look at surgeons like yourself and say, you can be the best gosh darn surgeon in the world, and you are. But at the end of the day, it's going to matter how that patient and how that family is cared for after the surgery and in the ICU and on the floor, and how the food services person interacting with them or housekeeping. It matters because that perception of care is everything. And so culture, I always say, is everything. We can talk about it all day long. It has to be pervasive, top to bottom. It has to be lived every day. And you have to also be willing to make some tough choices, whether I'm talking about physicians or I'm talking about an employee. If the behavior and the culture doesn't mirror what integrity looks like, if it doesn't mirror what truly compassion looks like, and if at the end of the day you can't respect your peer or you don't respect what's being, then you have to be able to really make some tough calls. And we do. But luckily, if you put the culture together right, you have, I would say that's I can count on one hand that you have to make those tough calls.
Erica?
Well, I think, Debbie, you and I could go all day long on culture. Like, we could do our own sort of just think tank on culture, the two of us, and just geek out on culture for like hours because I completely share your vision on culture. I mean, there's this old saying, you've heard it a million times, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. Okay. And really, culture is at the top of the hierarchy of running any organization. And why is that? I think Debbie and I are the same in this way, which is, at the end of the day, it's human beings who are doing whatever it is we're doing, providing healthcare, running hospitals, or in my case, running companies, inventing things, advancing medical technologies. It comes down to humans, and I've said this before, which is these jobs would be super easy if it weren't for the humans. If we had a whole lot of robots that we could just program to do exactly what it is we want them to do, it might be easier. So in the end, it's 100% about how do we get the humans all swimming in the right direction, all sort of leading the charge. And at Silk Road, at our company, culture is at the top of the hierarchy. Like you, Debbie, we talk about it every day, and we had the advantage of being able to brand and name and give our culture a true name. And so we call it the cartwheel culture. I won't get into that, but there are elements of this cartwheel culture that are lived and breathed every day. It's not something that they just get at orientation. People hear about cartwheel culture on day one, but it's something that that has to be practiced every day. And what I tell all the employees is that I am not the head of culture. If you're relying on me as the leader to be the culture and to propagate the culture, we are all going to fail. Because culture is about everyone. Culture is about every single person at Silk Road waking up every single day and wanting to practice the culture, because culture is something that you practice. It's not something that is done to you. It's not something that exists in the ether. It's something that you do. And you have to be mindful about it. And so that's sort of, for us, number one. And number two really is, how do you bring about this culture of innovation and trust and integrity and all the things that, Debbie, you were just talking about? And for us, it all comes down to a very famous Texan, Brene Brown, who you probably know, I would imagine, given your proximity, who has talked about kind of Daring Greatly and Dare to Lead and all of those books and things that she's written about. And at the top of what she talks about is blame and shame and extracting that from your culture. Because if you have a culture of finger pointing, that person did this person did that, you'll never get to where you, Debbie, want to go and I want to go. And so the way I look at that is, we've defined the culture, we've said what's acceptable, what isn't, we're not going to tolerate blame and shame, and then you have to physically extract the people who don't want to go on this journey, to your point. And luckily it's very, very few. And failing fast in that regard. You hire somebody new and you figure out within a very short period of time, Are they in this culture or are they not in this culture? And failing fast and removing those people. Because, you know, if we let that persist, I know you feel the same way, Debbie, is, you know, you end up sort of poisoning the well. And so for us, you'll be happy to know, also took a decade.
Well, I just would say, you know, I'm acutely aware we have physicians who are all listening on the phone. They're thinking, is it me? Is it me? They must be talking about all those other people. That's just those people that run the hospital. No, trust me, it's you. Your actions make a difference. And I can assure you, particularly if you're working in a hospital, and again, I always say I don't care who writes your paycheck. You could be in private practice, you may be with a multi-specialty group, you may be employed by the hospital. I don't care. There's a way that we behave. And there's a certain point, and I can assure you, strong leaders that run strong organizations, there's a point where if we can't work collectively together because your values aren't aligned, it's okay if you go to the competitor. It's okay.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly.
You have to come from a position of strength. And I say that because, again, remember, our number one goal, right, is the patient. And if you want to work for an organization and the culture is to do great things, and I've got the confidence that we want to be right aligned with bringing latest and greatest innovations to drive a different outcome, then I'm looking for somebody who maybe isn't exactly aligned with that same vision. And that's okay.
Yeah. So true. We call it the North Star, which is the patient-centric point of view. Everything we do every day is about the patients, whether it's in the clean room, the R&D lab, customer service, wherever it is, it's always about the patient. And in fact, we have the North Star emblazoned on our front doors so that everybody coming through is reminded every day that this is really what we're talking about, patients at the end of the day. And, you know, I think, Debbie, if we're doing our jobs right, people love to work in our organizations. And so generally what we find is a real leaning into the culture because people love it and they understand that we have a North Star, and that is greater than all of us combined.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating conversation. You know, sometimes I see physicians consumed with our competition in town. I go, don't worry about our competition. You know, if we execute and do what we do well, you don't need to worry about anybody. And I'm sure the same mantra is that it's not about, you know, blocking the other people. It's about executing on our strategy, building that internal culture, and nobody can beat us if we actually do it. Only we can beat us from internally, actually.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, Palma, you got another question?
I do. So medical devices and cutting edge innovation oftentimes hit roadblocks related to payers and the ability to pay for these instruments. I'd like to see what perspectives these leaders have regarding that. How can we achieve that or work around them?
Yeah, I mean, this is the perfect kind of dovetail, Dr. Shaw, to what we were just talking about, which is, you know, I would say that my experience with payers has been incredibly favorable, and I would actually kind of disagree even with the nature of the question, with all respect, because I think it's all about how do you come at the question. And if we're involving payers in the conversation from the very beginning, and as an innovator, as an inventor myself, if I have a new idea in healthcare that I think is going to solve a real unmet clinical need, I'm going to talk to the 3 Ps. I'm going to talk to patients. I'm going to understand their real need. I'm going to talk to providers, which after today is always going to include Debbie. And I'm going to talk to payers. They are a critical part of understanding whether or not this piece of innovation is really going to be meaningful for them. And it goes back to what we talked about at the top of the hour, which is listening and understanding, in our case, the CMS point of view. And the CMS point of view is often around elderly females who are most of their constituents. And a lot of technologies come into the world and they're not even studied in elderly females, right? Those patients are often excluded from the clinical trials because, you know, they're very tight inclusion-exclusion criteria in order to satisfy the FDA requirements. And so it's finding that balance of making sure that we hear CMS in the beginning, from day one. And that's the approach that I've always taken, and we took that approach here at Silk Road, and we've had an incredibly favorable working relationship where we are listening to them every step of the way and providing the kind of evidence that the payer needs in order to make the right decision. And so I think if we do our jobs properly, we don't get to the end of the line, Dr. Shaw, where we've, advanced this thing, we've invented it, we've run the clinical trial, we got the FDA approval, we're trying to sell it into hospitals, and now we're knocking on the door of payers saying, oh, by the way, you need to pay for this new thing. That is really the wrong point in time for the payer to be learning about this advancement in medicine.
Yeah, I would have to probably take a little bit of a different view here. I just be perfectly candid. I'll give a couple of examples in my career. For the most part, it's very rare that CMS, in my experience, has paid for any new device that's basically been sold to the hospital on any procedure. That's not to say that that device hasn't had an impact from an efficiency, from a patient outcome perspective. But when someone says they're going to sell this and I say, well, tell me, has this basically, is CMS going to pay me any more for this? They go, well, we're working on it. So let me just give you an example. Robotic surgery. Everybody knows the Da Vinci, right? Robotic surgery. The hospital doesn't get paid a dime more for any type of robotic surgery that's being done. So they don't really care whether Medicare, whether you're going to do it open procedure or whether you're going to do it robotically. They don't really care whether the disposables, if one doc uses, $5,000 worth of disposable and another doc uses $200. You're getting paid what you're getting paid, period. How you want to manage it as a hospital and drive outcomes, that they do care about the outcomes piece. But no one cares about the dollars that you spent on that because they're going to pay you what they're going to pay. I would say the same thing is true. Let's use the latest example with TAVR. The reality is it's $50,000 more added on to what the existing expenses to do surgery, to do an intervention. There's not a dime more that's paid. So you can do it, and we're all going to hope, and we're working, right? Everybody's working through that in terms of efficiencies, better patient outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And we can all talk about the dollars and the savings that all happen down the line. There's only one time in my career that actually we've had some effectiveness of creating a new DRG. And that was actually here at Houston Methodist years ago when I had responsibility for the transplant program. And assist devices, which you all know, if you put in a heart assist device, the patients stay for a long time. It was a bridge to transplant. You were lucky at that time if they did go home. And of course, that was just under heart surgery. It wasn't even under the transplant at that time. And so we actually were effective in working through with a group to actually create its own DRG and really influence. But in general, I would say that when we talk about reimbursements and we talk about managed care, it's fine if it's managed care because understand you're getting a % off of whatever your bill charges are. But the reality is, and when we look at the majority of most hospitals in this country, the patients you're caring for are Medicare. And so when you talk about that, you're most likely going to lose money on those. And so I think it's really about, again, this is the conversation we had earlier in this discussion, which is, I think as we come together, I think if industry and hospitals come together sooner in the journey, right, in terms of its impact, then it's not a sell upon actually it's time for implementation or a clinical trial. So that's my standpoint on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could talk all day long about CMS. I mean, it's interesting because they're so often vilified, and the fact is they're incredibly hardworking, really smart people inside CMS who are trying to to uphold their own fiduciary responsibility, right, in the role that they have. And they're interesting because they're at this unique intersection, which is not the FDA, whose job is to determine safety and effectiveness, and that's not necessarily the job of CMS, right? They're simply about they're simply an insurance provider, right? And so I find that they're often tasked with doing something that is outside their role, right, in evaluating new technologies, and so. I agree with you. I think there are some, TAVR is a really great example where the device costs, outstrip the sort of DRG reimbursement. And I think it's understanding that value proposition and whether or not there are other savings within the system that account for that and those kinds of things. And these have to be open conversations with the payers, with FDA. And I think that FDA and CMS have made some really important strides, which is this kind of dual review process, whereby now you can start your FDA process and start your reimbursement process at the same time, so that you're sure to design your clinical trials to look at the things that the payer cares about, so that they can begin to make changes in the DRG itself, the coverage for the DRG. And so I think what we're in violent agreement about is that there is need for improvement. I do know that there are some examples, ours is one, where we've been successful at developing a new technology that has advanced patient care, and has done so in a cost protective way, where it's net neutral or net beneficial for hospitals. But that started 15 years ago, at the very inception of this idea. And so that, I think we're in violent agreement about that, which is getting on these questions earlier.
So let me pick up on that, Erica, because a segue into your particular technology. And there was a great article, I think it was Joan Bergen wrote many years ago. Carotid endarterectomy was developed here, by the way, by Dr. DEBAKEY. I know they claim it in England a little bit, but we think it's probably happened here at Houston Methodist. And what John Bergen wrote was, this is kind of like a resilient champion, often on the ropes but never defeated. Another new technology comes along to challenge this. And so I've got to tell you, when I heard about making a little incision to deliver a stent, that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Well, that's really usually a blessing, but I get it completely wrong. It means you're destined for great things. So what did you see? Because this was not a slam dunk that this was going to kind of take over the marketplace, and yet it is. And so it involves vision, on your behalf to kind of take on that kind of risk.
Yeah, no question. I think this dovetails nicely with what we were just talking about, which is, I had the advantage of kind of going to school on transfemoral carotid artery stenting. I worked at Boston Scientific for a period of time, saw those technologies advance, and the whole idea was to take minimally invasive medicine, catheter-based medicine, and move it into the carotid artery. And I think, what was the drive to do that 25 or 30 years ago with transfemoral stents was to get away from the incision and the general anesthesia and the potential complications that can happen with CEA, like cranial nerve injury and others. And so along comes transfemoral CAS. Well, unfortunately, it failed to live up to the promise of being as good as carotid endarterectomy, right? In terms of patient safety around the index procedure. And so when I was presented with the opportunity to be the CEO of Silk Road, I said to myself, this is either going to be a giant success or a disaster. There's like nothing in between, right? Because it's pretty binary. And so having lived through transfemoral carotid stenting, I was very nervous, to your point, Dr. Lumsden. I was like, why would I touch this with a 10-foot pole? This is like, this is a moat with alligators. But I also looked at the technology and I said, you know what? This is solving some of the fundamental Achilles heels of carotid stenting. And so this is either going to work or not work, and we're going to know in a fairly reasonably short clinical trial. And so I'm willing to kind of bet the farm and bet my career and go through this clinical trial and understand what do we have. And I have this crazy saying that I borrowed from somebody many years ago, which is there a there there? And like you, I really questioned, is there a there there? Is there anything there in this crazy thing? And by the way, we didn't even call it TCAR back then. It didn't even have a name. But one thing I did know was that vascular surgeons had invented this procedure, right? And a couple of them were doing it, and they were propagating it sort of around the world quietly, and luckily had filed some patents, which we were luckily able to acquire. So necessity is the mother of invention, and the fact that vascular surgeons were doing this on their own, sort of in a kludged together kind of a way, and the fact that we could fail fast, and this goes back to what we talked about 10 minutes ago, failing fast is always my mantra here. I I decided to take the risk. And then it was, after the very first clinical trial, really understanding that this was in fact a giant leap forward in carotid disease.
Well, let me segue that over to Dr. Sukin and talking about, is this crazy? Let me take you back to the Baylor Methodist split that occurred. We refer to this as the divorce. These organizations have been together for 50 years. Everybody in this community expected it was going to be re-upped. And all of a sudden, overnight, these two organizations came apart. And at Methodist, no medical students, no residents, no fellows, no IRB, no graduate medical education. It was all gone. It was part of the school. And oh, by the way, we've never actually employed a doctor. And so the leadership, the administrative leadership said, we're going to build a brand new academic organization. Like you, I thought these people have no idea what they're talking about. This is never going to work. Am I along for this ride? Because it's probably going to have to move. Talk to me about the same kind of risk that Erica's talking about. One real obvious that this is going to be successful. Not so much the success story, but the thought processes that you go through in this situation.
Yeah, I would say the strength and the philosophy, when you talk about big visions, it really is coming from a position of strength. And I think this idea of a collaboration partnership, I think we all explore it, but there comes a point in time where you say, can you really partner? Can you really be aligned? And when you come to a point where you can look at each other and say, we're not aligned. You can't see a future where you can actually get folks around the table to move that one vision forward instead of being scared of what, and this is, I think, gets back to the point we were talking about working where competitors are. If you're always looking over your shoulder as to what's happening to right and to the left, it's hard to focus on that big vision. And so we come from a position of strength. And that position of strength said, we want to be in the top 10 of all hospitals nationwide. We want to be in the top 10 with U.S. News and World Report. We want to be a leading academic health center. We want to have a research institute. And yet, we want an ability to be able to influence, and I think this is a key word, medicine across the globe. And when you look all that, when you put all that down, you're like, well, how are we going to do this? And you don't think you have a partner, then that therein lies where you start charting a course, your own course. And it has been remarkable. It's been remarkable in the how we've put it together. And I'll just use an example, particularly on the Research Institute. It's just like building a new hospital with 5 hospitals sitting around you. Strategy is everything. So how are you going to put it together to differentiate and not be duplicative, but surpass? And what you want is to leapfrog in advance of all of your partners. What you want to do is to be able to really put together a plan that can be objective, but also can drive those outcomes. And I would say, again, big believer, big visions are not realized in a day, and they take decades. And if you think about a department vision, those probably are a programmatic vision. You can start to see the results maybe within 24 months, which is what you need. Mm-hmm. It keeps people excited. It keeps people engaged. But these visions of developing a Methodist DeBakey Heart Center, or whether developing like what we've done here at Houston Methodist and creating our own academic institution, our own research institute, these things really take more than a decade. And you're doing well when you can begin to, and of course you always do, benchmark up against, not your local competitors. If you're going to make a difference, it really is your national competitors, and begin to see what you can do around the globe. So I hope that shares our perspective.
Debbie, the thing that strikes me about your story so much is the bravery. Your individual bravery, the courage to take that on. I have to say, I'm humbled by that. I'm not sure I would have the courage to do what you did. But the courage to have a vision that is going to take 10 years, and in our case, it's been more than 10 years. This company was founded in 2007. And so, taking on these giant challenges and the bravery to do so is, hats off to you. That's impressive.
Palma, there's a couple of questions came in. I think we've answered number 2, but let me, if I may, jump in with the first one. And basically it says, if culture and overall patient care are paramount, are there new innovations taking place around culture or patient care? And then the second part of that question is, are we still primarily limited by availability of, let's say, compassionate healthcare professionals on the hospital side, let's say, engineers and salespeople on the industry side? I mean, how do we keep, that's another example of a supply chain. You gotta have the people coming in through it. And is there any innovation that help that?
I do think there's innovation. So 2 questions. The word that someone asked about, compassionate healthcare professionals. Okay, let me just say, I talk about this every day. I don't think anybody comes to work in a hospital who doesn't want to do good. And I think that's a really important point. You have to come and lead these organizations, lead departments, that everybody has the right intent. So I choose to believe that everybody comes here who is compassionate and wants to make a difference. I think that when you start to talk about technology and how is it impacting how the care is delivered out of being respectful, I think, COVID's been a great example as to how we have utilized technology to change the way we deliver the care and be compassionate. So imagine now, right, you've all been working in places and, family members can no longer come in to their family members. And every time a patient needs anything, right, you have your care provider, which has to essentially gown up in more ways than one, not your simple gown, to be able to assist. So we've done things where we've been working with industry, as an example, with Amazon and with Alexa. And what we did early on is we put Alexa devices, as we've been working with them, in every one of our rooms. We piloted initially in our COVID floors, and now we've actually deployed them across. And so in things like not only being able to do touchless, being able to call a family member, right, and teaching a patient to be able to do that, being able to order food services. So instead of, again, somebody having to make another trip in and another trip out, and being able to give a patient the respect for, they have the ability to order their food is the one thing that hopefully they can do. If they were intubated in the ICU, maybe not. But it's beginning to put those things in there. Being able to provide music, because you know what? It's a lonely experience. And how do you create that culture, and how do you create those? So, an Alexa device is one of those. Being able to provide our consultants who perhaps were not directly taking care of a patient, but needed to do a consult, right? We all saw telemedicine, right? All of our telehealth visits just take off. That was, our way of bringing technology to the patient in a way where it really propelled and moved that forward, but it was in a way, obviously, to be respectful, to do in a way where we could get them care the fastest that they needed it, and also protect our professionals as well. So those are 2 really easy ones. There's a lot of other examples, everything from robotics and our robotic sanitizers that would go around the hospital and in the rooms, and I can go on and on, but I'm just going to use those as a couple.
Thank you. Palma, we're going to run out of time, and you've got some great questions. You want to choose the priorities?
Yeah, I need to ask. Thank you. I have to ask this because it's something I want to hear about, and I know a lot of women do. I know vascular surgeons admire Erica, and I'm sure, Debbie, in your world, you have many admirers, women that look up to you as not only pillars of strength, but leaders, and just brilliant and so well spoken, and look at your position that you've achieved. And what we really would want to know is, and being a female CEO, right? How do you think that your experience has been different from your male peers? And did you have any advantages as a woman that maybe we could, use? Or were there any disadvantages that you came across?
I love this question so much. I get asked this all the time. And so I would say one of the major differences between being a female, Debbie's nodding her head like, yeah. One of the major differences is people ask you, what's it like to be a female CEO? Whereas if I'm a male, no one says, what's it like to be a male CEO? Right? It's like, so true. That's number one. Number 2 is, oftentimes if I'm at, let's say SVS, Dr. Lumsden, and I'm walking the exhibit hall right around with other folks, and I'll be introduced to somebody as this is the CEO of Silk Road Medical. There's often this like, you're the CEO? Like, and you know that what's behind that is, how is that possible? Because you are clearly a woman, right? So there's this really interesting moment in time where there's like shock and awe. But I will say this, Dr. Shaw, this is all changing. There are more and more women leaders every day. And in fact, there are at least 3 of my colleagues in healthcare who are outstanding women CEOs in the medical device and medical technology space. And so I'm no longer alone, which is just feels great. So, you know, how has the career trajectory been different? I have to unfortunately say to you, I don't think it's been holistically different for me. I think it's, you put in the time, you put in the hard work, you take on the tough challenges. I will say, as women, and maybe Debbie, this is why you and I are drawn to these crazy hard problems. I think as women, we tend to want to overachieve. So if anything, we're going to take on a harder problem than maybe our male counterparts would, because we're, you know, I think we're, 1, confident in our own abilities, but 2, just this desire to really make something of ourselves is potentially very strong, and against sort of the tide of, you know, people saying, well, prove it, you know, prove it to me that you're really worthy. And so, but we put in the hard time, we do the hard work, we take on the tough challenges, and I was lucky enough to grow up in an environment where my parents never told me I was disadvantaged by my gender. So I never had this belief system that as a woman I would somehow not have the same, you know, opportunities. And so it wasn't ingrained in me. And as I started out my career as a sales rep, carrying the bag for the Upjohn company, and by the way, I did my training in medical devices in Houston. Working for Meditech, which of course became Boston Scientific, and I got trained as a sales rep for a month, living at the Embassy Suites in Houston. But even at those very early days, when I was in the sales organization, it never occurred to me that somehow I would be held back as a result of my gender. It just never occurred to me. And so I just kept doing what I do, which is try to be the best possible professional in whatever role I'm given. And so I think that sometimes sometimes we do ourselves a disservice, and that we automatically think that we're disenfranchised somehow. And I think if we just eliminate that from our thinking and assume that we're on a level playing field, it sort of works out. I'm curious, Debbie, if any of that.
Well, I could absolutely say ditto. I think in order to do what you do well, you're completely passionate about it. And it's just a drive, and it's not a drive because you think you wake up in the morning and say, well, gosh, I'm female, and you know, it's going to be a different journey for me. You're just passionate, and so you're curious, and you work hard. All those things are true. I would say I'm smiling because it is I will just tell you, it's been my experience, and it continues to be experience. When you say, you know, you're the CEO of X, whether it's a company or I say I'm the CEO of a hospital, they're like, oh, you? And you're like, yes, me. And, you know, and I've been doing this now for 15 years. So when I was 15 years younger, it was really, oh, you? Yes, me. And so I think that what I would say are 2 things. One, I'll just share with you. I think that I do think our male counterparts, I will say, they'll say things to you that they would never say. And I do believe that. They would say things to you that they will never say to their male peers. And that is the God's honest truth. And so who cares? You have to have thick skin and you move on. But that is a true statement. What I would say, though, is using it to your advantage. I will share with you, I believe I'm a better leader. I'm a compassionate leader. And it doesn't mean that I'm not a hard-driven, direct leader, but I am a compassionate leader. And I'll share with you, really because of my children. You know, I have the same life experiences. I always say I'm a full-time wife, I'm a full-time mom, and I'm a full-time CEO. And I can't tell you how that's going to measure up on any given day. But what I can tell you is I have the same responsibilities of ensuring that my kids, you know, lunch is packed, school's on time, you know. Do I have help? Yes, but somebody's managing that, managing the house, managing hospitals, and all those things. And so I would say that our ability to be successful is because I juggle many things, and I think women do that, and they do it well because they have a lot of practice at it. And that's just true.
Yeah. No question about it. And the sort of funny things that have been said and not so funny things. I mean, really abusive and abrasive things that have been said and done. I'm sure all the women on this program today can tell some story about some very disrespectful moment that has happened. But I think in our case, I think the three of us chose not to let that bring us down, and instead to make us stronger, which is, people can say and do anything they want, and I'm gonna prevail through all of that, right? And that's just an incredible belief system that we have. And I'm with you. I think we're juggling artists for sure. We've got the circus act down. That definitely helps.
So Palma, we've only got about 3 or 4 minutes left. What other poignant questions have you got?
I guess the only thing, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that we female vascular surgeons, mothers, single mom, whatever it may be, we're big jugglers. We juggle many things, and we manage. We manage at the office, we manage in the operating room, we manage the kids. We're multitasking every minute of every day. So I love hearing your version of that. It's just excellent. And I guess
Palma,
if there's any decision.
If I can make a point, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that before. It is so obvious. And I do think women do that much better. I get to focus on what I do. I don't have to juggle. In fact, the house would be a disaster. But I've never really heard somebody articulate that is a true strength that I think the women have that most guys don't have, actually.
Well, and the important piece to that, and I'll just say this, is it's a really important piece of where I think we're saying where we allows us to focus is I have perspective. Mm-hmm. So you could be having your worst day in the world. You can scream at me all you want to. I have perspective.
We often do.
I just have perspective. That's it, right? I have perspective that maybe many others can't just pause for a moment. And that's, I would share, that's been my greatest asset in terms of doing my job.
Okay, Palma, we probably need to wind it up. We could do this probably for another 3 hours quite easily. I told you, we just needed to sit back and let it flow.
I just want to let Debbie and Erica make last comments because I know we'll run out of time. It's just been amazing.
Well, I've shared, I think, my parting words. I'm really honored, and thank you so much for inviting me here today. This has been so much fun, so I'm going to pass it over to you, to Erica.
Yeah, I completely agree. Just a giant breath of fresh air, and I can't wait to get to know all of Debbie, you better, and of course Dr. Lumsden, Dr. Shaw, spending more time with all of you. I really thank you for this invitation. It's been very eye-opening. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for watching. Thank you very much, Erica and Debbie, for participating. Thanks to Palma. I really think there's some pretty powerful messages that came out that are not necessarily mainstream, but are probably reality. Thank you very much for participating, and I think you helped a lot of people. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.